Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 9 cheat sheet. So we've come off the international break in Game Week 8, and we've had a lot of information here with some really good performances this game week that have changed my mind, some team performances that have probably changed the pecking order of certain players as well. And I've just watched the West Ham game too, completely dismayed with their performance, but even more so with, I really just can't even explain the lineup that they put out to start the game, which saw them get overwhelmed pretty much for the first half, and then within the second half, I think that they were pretty much nothing again, but Brentford continued to overwhelm them for most of the match, or played at a pace where I think they're able to kind of quite comfortably keep their lead. When we look at, for example, the landscape, I think the big shift that's really happening right now is there are a lot of players who I think situationally work really well, who are quite expensive within the midfield position, that are all very good. And in the forward position, you almost have a restriction of 2 to 3 players that I think we all like, and otherwise that entire landscape is a bit of a cesspit. In terms of the defense, I think it's one where I don't think we should overreact too massively. I think there have been some teams, some hauls from players that are very, very cheap, equally some players who've done DEFCON every single match. And what we need to see, for example, with the Mukiela haul is just the appreciation that anyone from a good team can do that, or even quite a weak team, right? We've seen, for example, the Ballard haul previously, but maybe, the wider context within the season is anyway, Sunderland have been quite impressive. But we know that a Leeds player could do that. And equally, some of the more expensive players can do that, but some of the more expensive teams have not really impressed as a defense. And we'll talk about that as a narrative going forwards. But I think the bet is still on that some of the value within defense is still there. I know right now it just seems like Arsenal and maybe Daniel Munoz is proving it. But that's sort of my view within the defense. As far as the midfield, though, I think we're starting to see a much more reduction within that sort of budget tier. And let's just jump into the cheat sheet. So, as ever, the cheat sheet and the stats are all supported by the Opta Stats tool from Fantasy Football Hub. You can actually use the Opta Stats tool yourself to actually look at how players are performing this season, and then also even compare it to last season if you want to do that, and their historical numbers, just to see what's the shift, what's the dramatical change from players, and even have a look at CBIT and how players are doing so far. So we have the data here, but if you want to look at this and see how that also kind of transfers towards suggested data, have a look at, or expected data rather, have a look at the link in description below for the Fantasy Football Hub Team AI model as well. So jumping with the midfield, I think the key change is Longstaff gets added in for Leeds. The big thing here is that I mentioned about this, last week when I dropped Stack, but actually, we're starting to see Longstaff basically play the full minutes of the match. Stack is someone who now is getting substitutions, and so I think Stack has to go out of the cheat sheet because the value towards him was really some external or some additional CBIT gain. With Longstaff, you have the minutes here and at least set pieces, because he's also taken that away from Stack. I think Dewsbury Hall might actually be the best 5 million alongside Granit Xhaka. I think these two are my favorites, and then Ayari is actually playing enough football to also, I think deserve being in and around that tier. The key thing with Xhaka is that he is just really good at CBIT per 90 compared to Dewsbury Hall, who just simply isn't. Dewsbury Hall still is on some set pieces. I think he's on a marginally better team. Now, he hasn't shown anything too impressive in terms of open play so far, but you can see the XAG per 90 is there. It is real, and it is quite tangible. So Longstaff is also someone who kind of reproduces that to a similar degree. But I think when you kind of think about some of the fixtures in the short term, I do think the Sunderland games are very, very tough. Some of the Everton games within the next 3 matches are very, very good, but then they also get quite bad. So this kind of landscape I still think is not full of value necessarily, but if you wanted to play or had some of these players that you were forced to play and they're maybe like your 8th attacker, I think that's okay. Or even if they're your 7th attacker sometimes, and you're trying to, let's say, maximize the value by going for a team that has huge big hitters. Like, for example, if you want to get a Saka plus Haaland team going, these are the types of players you need, and I completely understand that this is the necessity. So for me, that's the context. Within the next year, I just think there's really no reason to spend, but Anderson is still at a really good price point. Arias still has at least one good game, and we'll see how he gets on. CBIT numbers are still quite interesting for him, but that's not really why you want to buy him, and I completely understand why people might be dismayed so far. With Jade Anthony, it seems like that whole sort of storyline of whether he's able to hold up this underlying stats, I still think is very prevalent. The Burnley games are still pretty poor in the distance, and I think we can easily and comfortably say that they're still a really, really poor team. I think even when you look at, for example, the amount of chances they created versus Leeds at home, that's just simply not good enough. I think if you're going to play multiple games over and over again, look at tougher matches, I'm just not expecting too much, but I'm happy for Anthony to surprise me with Palhinha. I think the CBIT rate's a little bit too low, so that's why I still don't love him too much. He does actually get a lot of shots for someone who plays, quite defensively. So the NPXG is, a touch higher than, for example, some of the 5 million players who don't get shots off. And the only player who compares on this list, for example, is Arias and Jane Anthony. These are not kind of CBIT players, right? So I think his rate is a bit too low for me to like, considering he doesn't have external things like set pieces, etc., things that can actually rack up your bonus over the course of a game. And then in the Knicks here, I think we still have a lot of value, but I've dropped Paqueta, and I just simply had to react towards that West Ham performance. This was one of West Ham's best games over this run, right? We talked about this 3-4 game week run that started from Brentford at home, and the lineup was awful. The performance was worse. I don't really know what to say. I own Paqueta. I think I will look to sell Paqueta as soon as possible. There's not too much else to be said, really. It's pretty awful. With Reinders, I think the minutes being so poor just means that in the short term, he's really poor as well. Because if the minutes aren't great and the run of fixtures are Aston Villa away, Bournemouth at home, Liverpool at home, the next time you'll probably want to actually own a City player is game week 13. So for me, I think even though a lot of people can look at Reinders so far and say that he's actually produced some decent value, I think the key thing is that he's gotten some price rises. He doesn't get CBIT. And I think the value towards him being a very, very good FPL pick was actually being basically an 80-minute player within the game. I was quite shocked at the 58-minute sub, but it also makes sense because Bernardo Silva can't sit on the bench forever. And as I said last week, and the reason why we gave Reinders a drop was also because you're starting to see a lot of these wingers play much more minutes out wide, and they're just doing like for like substitutions. Marmoush is not even back in the game, but even Cherki's coming back, and he can be, for example, a wing type sub. Bob is usually on the periphery. Savinho gets to play on the right. Doku now plays most exclusively on the left, although he was benched within one of the preceding games, and so that's just the concern, right? And that has a knock-on impact on Reinders, because I feel like Foden actually, almost on the contrary, actually has really, really good minutes. But I feel like Foden and the value towards Foden as an FPL player has almost completely dissipated, because when you look at the NPXG and XAG numbers, and I know I'm jumping here on the cheat sheet, but I think it's worth talking about the City piece, because this run against for City is awful. If you want to see the way that City play and how they've played so far, almost all the XG is tilted towards Haaland. Haaland is on a nuclear run when it comes to XG per 90. NP, that is, and every single player almost seems to have suffered. Foden is at a career worst number of shots per game. So when you're looking at Foden, I think the minutes are there, but the value towards him, I don't quite see it, even though he's been quite a creative player. And you can see, for example, as I mentioned, some of the UCL matches where he's gotten really good XAG, even in the previous match where he got a lot of XAG, but no XG, I think, is not a good reason to say that Foden's a good hold right now. And when the fixtures for City are so poor, I think you almost expect a little bit worse anyways for most of the players, but Haaland is the exception almost. In the next tier, I really think that Njai deserved a rise. He's been fantastic. That performance for City was probably one of his best performances that I've seen. And I've actually watched Njai a lot. Like I owned Njai last season as well for the double. He's a player that I think is very, very good. And I think the big transformational piece with Njai this season is you can see his numbers have completely flown up compared to last season, where I think he was barely, I mean, he was very mild creative threat, and even from a goal threat perspective, he was not up there. Now, there's a big gap between what he's producing so far and what a Sarr is producing, or what an Enzo is producing. But of course, with small sample size, I expect some of the Enzo and Sarr numbers to trickle down. And for example, the Sarr number just did, even after a great game versus Bournemouth from a collective team perspective from Crystal Palace. But the key thing with Njai is that he's on penalties and that the DEFCON rate is real, right? What's impressive here is when you look at, let's say, the comparison between a Paqueta and an Njai. I mean, some of the value that we were talking about, or at least I was talking about with Paqueta, would be that he can get you DEFCONs. But with Njai actually doing what he's doing, even though he sometimes plays 80 minutes, 82 minutes, 85 minutes only, as opposed to the full 95 minutes of the game, he's actually able to hit that threshold because that rate is much better. With regards to the other players, I think Enzo is still here, but there's a massive asterisk because we don't exactly know how fit he is. Apparently, he still hasn't been pictured in Chelsea training, so of course there still needs to be an asterisk associated with Enzo. With Kudus, I would still say that these Tottenham fixtures are okay. I think that some people will definitely be considering selling Kudus, but I think some of the value towards Kudus is the next 3 games are actually quite nice because at least 2 of them are at home. And he's still playing enough minutes and producing enough value across both NPXG and XAG, where I think he's actually good for this price point. As I said last week, it's not helpful to kind of conflate that Enzo and Sarr almost feel like that they're underpriced, and using that as a basis to say Kudus is overpriced, right? I think Kudus is actually producing more than enough value right now in this sort of position. especially considering he gets set pieces. We know that there are knock-on impacts on things like bonus, right? So when you look at someone like Bruno, who's only on one half of the set pieces, very much a similar situation to someone like Kudus, he can find himself to getting triple bonus within certain games, because that's kind of the value of being that sort of perpetual chance creator of a certain team, which is something that Enzo technically doesn't share, even though he's on some set pieces, and Sar definitely doesn't because he's not. So yeah, I love all of these players. If I really had to prioritize them, I think the order that I would always prioritize them is going to be Sar first, then Enzo, then Njai, then Kudus. But I don't think you'll ever feel bad about owning these players currently. And maybe when the fixtures get worse for Everton and Tottenham, then maybe we can reassess. With Njai, you know, he goes towards AFCON. With Sar, you know, that's the same thing, but his fixture run is basically amazing up until then. And then with Enzo, as long as he's fit, I mean, reasonably speaking, as long as you can get him for the Wolves at home game, he's just money. And with Kudus, I think he probably has the worst fixtures of the rest, but he kind of has more guarantees in terms of minutes than all of them, outside of maybe Sar, if he can sort of be managed throughout the European games. With Rice, I've actually added him to the cheat sheet. I think he's also someone who's quite interesting. He's actually outscored some of these players so far, but I feel like the kind of lasting value of some of these players is, first of all, how would you want to triple up versus on Arsenal? And then whether or not you actually want to use one of those spots on Rice. I personally still think that I would go for someone like Sar. I think that Rice is overperformed just a touch. You can actually see that within the goals assist per 90 compared to some of the underlying numbers. And once again, he just doesn't really do CBIT. So I think there's no reason to sort of look at Rice as some sort of jack of all trades. He simply isn't. But he's an interesting pick to have. And I think actually the irony might be that he's still a better pick than someone like Eze right now within the game. With Mitoma, he gets a drop because I've still got the uncertainty around his injury, and there's not much else to be said by that. In the next tier, we kind of have Gakpo, Gordon, Eze. I've given Gakpo another rise, so that's 2 rises in a week. I think, once again, him being the absolute focal point of every single key chance that Liverpool had outside of, let's say, Konate slipping in Isak for a 1-on-1 versus Man United in the first half just says that if you wanted to contextualize where Liverpool are, I mean, they're kind of struggling as a team to sort of get results. Gakpo almost seems like the player who's actually on fire, who's actually being able to get things going. You saw Salah actually get subbed off for the first time in my memory under Slot in a Premier League game where they actually needed a goal at 85 minutes. So he came off for Frimpong, and Gakpo has actually been playing a lot of these matches consistently. So I think the impressive thing here is I think that if you wanted to add the proper context, I guess Gakpo is that person right now who seems like he's saving Slot's job. If you wanted to sort of make that metaphor, I don't think Slot's actually in danger. I'm just making the joke here, but technically Gakpo is in a very important spot within the team. I think the underlying stats are very, very good for him too. I believe he actually leads the game in midfielders for NPXGI per 90 and also flat NPXGI. So that just shows you how prolific Gakpo has been. And I think now that the minutes have severely upticked, he's just a very, very good pick. So once again, following the trend from last week in terms of where I moved him. I didn't give Eze a rise last week. And the reason why I didn't give him a rise is because I was very cautious about his minutes. Now, as I said in the previous week too, I think I was cautious about Gordon. I mean, I was not cautious about Gordon's minutes 2 weeks ago on the Game Week, let's say 7 cheat sheet, but then the Game Week 8 cheat sheet, I felt like I needed to make an immediate reaction to Gordon. In this case, I think this is a reaction to Eze, where I think the minutes were actually even worse than I actually had almost thought. And given that he's actually prone to getting a 60-minute sub, or, you know, can potentially get one, and some of the depth within the team is coming back soon, with players like maybe Havertz, who can play dual roles within the team, with players like, let's say, Madueke around the corner. I think you basically just want to make your bed with the Arsenal players that you're buying in now. You want to own Arsenal players who you don't mind keeping for the next, you know, I don't know, 8-10 game weeks. I mean, what is the point really of spending transfers yo-yoing around Arsenal players? I am doing it myself now because I kind of want to get that right. So I think the point that I'm saying now is when you're sort of recontextualizing how you want to triple up on Arsenal, I think that Eze drop is very fair. Once again, the key thing from moving from Crystal Palace to Arsenal is that even though you're playing for a much better team on paper, the irony, I guess, is Crystal Palace become the best attacking side within the country. And then on top of that, Eze's lost set pieces, he's lost penalty share, and he's lost minutes. And so, understandably, he's just not going to be a good pick at this price point. Within the next tier, Semenyo and Mbeumo are interesting. I think I've given Mbeumo a rise, and this is just simply, you're coming off of Liverpool away game. This is probably your worst fixture on the run. United are now comfortably sitting at 3rd within the league in NPXG and 1st if you include the penalties. So Mbeumo just looks like a really, really good pick. Cunha has a mixture of minutes because you can see sort of what's going on in terms of, I think quite smart actually from Rim to actually play Cunha. I think he had a fantastic performance versus Liverpool, and the way that he was sort of able to hold out the ball in quite a dynamic manner that I don't think Sesko would have ever been able to do within that specific game is interesting. So that I think hurts Cunha, because even though he can play multiple positions like center forward and left attacking mid, sort of Mount's importance to the team has also kind of hurt him. Whereas with Mbemo, I feel like Mbemo and Ahmad are almost a lock on that right hand side. So Mbemo is just money from that perspective, and he also gets you all that sort of XAG value from the set pieces too. And United seem to be actually quite good this season at being able to make use of set pieces, and I guess the more that they're going to play Maguire full 90 minutes with the match, the more you have a set piece threat. With Foden dropping, this is going back to that point that I made when I was talking about Reinders. I think when you actually look at kind of the profiling of Man City as a team this season, no one is a serious attacking threat outside of Haaland. There are players who might be assistive, but they are not players who are goal threats. And I think there are no players who are so creative that it almost warrants you ignoring, just owning Haaland, right? So what do I mean by that? If you look at Foden, you think that he's got chance creation. I mean, there's so many players in this list of players who actually just have slightly better XAG anyways than Foden. So I think there's not much to be said that Foden just has like excessively good value when they have really, really poor fixtures. So that's why Foden just has to drop for me. If anything, it's mostly fixture related, and I think less minutes related. With Bruno, I've given him a rise again. It's a tiring story every week to sort of talk about Bruno and to sort of see how people, I guess, dislike him so much, when actually there's so many players in the game that I think are letting us down, especially within, let's say, the forward position as well, with some of the expensive forwards. I think when I look at someone like Bruno, for example, he is absolutely fantastic, and he's someone who still produces a lot of value. Now, some of the games we're starting to see some earlier substitutions. I don't think that's going to be a recurring theme. Is he getting exactly as much DEFCON as we really want? I don't think he is. But you can see, I think that he is truly a jack of all trades in the sense that he does create a lot of chances. He does truly own set pieces. Amarim has reconfirmed him to be the penalty taker. I think we all expected that to be the case, and I think that's sort of what I suggested within the cheat sheet. But now that that's there, and we've seen a good performance with United actually playing well away from home, I almost feel like I have a bit more confidence with United as a team going forwards. I don't know if this is, am I overreacting to two wins in a row, or is it just the case that we're now 8 game weeks into the season and United have actually looked like a pretty comfortable offense? So why would you ever feel bad about owning someone who is a pretty key part of that offense, right? And someone who still can get you penalties for a team that historically has gotten you a lot of penalties as well. So for me, Bruno gets a rise. I think the fixture run's just better when you come off of Liverpool away, and that's always going to be the case for any sort of player. With Salah, I've given him a drop. I just think when you look at the underlying stats, it's just not good enough, right? It's not remotely good enough. He doesn't give you DEFCONs. The fixtures are so good for Liverpool, to be honest. And maybe in Game Week 12, we might reconsider, what our approach is to Salah. But I think, we've made all the points that we really need to week on week in terms of, has he gotten worse as a player? And I think you just kind of have to stand by that sort of logic. It just isn't good enough. And we just haven't seen enough really from Salah. And even though the fixtures might be better, he's still 14.4 million. I would rather just own Saka right now. I would rather just spend a little bit more money in some more premium players, but not have Salah and just have Haaland. But I can understand and appreciate why someone still wants to take the risk on Salah, because, some of the knock-on things, despite all the open play sort of worsening and the minutes worsening, is still things like penalties, still things like playing for a team like Liverpool, who can still create a lot of chances, as we saw, for example, within the game. I mean, even if you revisit the United game and the chances, I mean, he could have very well got, let's say, 1 goal, 1 assist within a game. But then the counter argument that I'm sure a lot of people are going to make is simply that he looks a bit washed and a little bit off it. And I don't think I can really disagree with that. Moving on towards the forward position, I think this is where we actually have the most amount of change. And I think the change is more so in terms of how you really want to approach your team structure. So you can either go really big at the back, like I have myself, in terms of spending the amount of money that I have, and then actually cut down towards some of the sort of budget players here like Krupke Jr. and Gu. Or I think you can actually approach it almost in a different way, and you can actually say, I still think that we actually have 3 or 4 big dons within the forward position, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But I think if we go back, take a step back and talk about that sort of structure where maybe you're willing to cut down to a 4.5, a 4.3, Krupke Jr. is interesting because Evan Nilsson has a soleus injury. My informal search of what this injury entails is that I think a minor version of this injury could see him miss 1 to 3 weeks of football. So maybe that means that Krupi Jr. starts in Game Week 9. I think the nice thing with Krupi Jr. is if you're using him as a make weight and you only necessarily might need him for Game Week 9, which is sort of what happens in my case, right? I am in I own Mateta, so I am like in a waiting room to reuse Mateta again. But for other people who might be in the same waiting room where you're actually looking towards getting Mateta in Game Week 9 or Game Week 10 rather, and you just need a placeholder for this 1 week, I think Krupi Jr. and you both might satisfy that exact goal, right? Krupi Jr. has actually looked really good so far in terms of the finishing quality. I think his manager's already spoken about how the big difference between someone like Krupi Jr. and Evan Nilsson is all the sort of things outside of the goal scoring. It's things like pressing at certain times, winning certain duels, hold up play. So there's a big difference in pressing as well, right? So the big difference I think is Krupi Jr. is not going to be like a 90-minute player like Evan Nilsson. I think as soon as Evan Nilsson comes back into the team, you're going to see, Krupi Jr. not start, in my opinion. I think that's quite likely going to happen. But this is the whole point, right? If you have the opportunity to maybe restructure your team, and I think that big template meta structural move is, and I'm not saying that this is the way to go, but I think it is one way to go about it, is this just general shift of move Gyökeres, if you own Gyökeres, into, let's say, Saka in the midfield and improve someone like Reinders, for example, who we've dropped in estimation, and then to move into someone like a Krupi Jr. or a Gu this week, right? Gu is also someone that I'm going to bring up because he was someone who was a substitute within the Nottingham Forest game, and as we all know, the lineup that showed up in the first half versus Nottingham Forest was absolutely awful, and they got played off the park, but they got played off to the park and actually didn't concede any goals, and then they actually made some substitutions, and then they actually comfortably won the game. And that was also supported by João Pedro dropping deeper, playing into the 10, Gu playing as a striker. Gu will almost be forced to play striker versus Ajax, so I don't think there's a need to overreact to that, right? João Pedro's not going to play that match. Enzo might not even make that game. So there's just so much potential for Gu to play minutes there. Whether he's going to be a good permanent FPL pick, I don't really think so. We also expect the lap probably around December, January, but I don't think Gu's minutes are ever going to be good, where if you're only playing, let's say, 60, 65 minutes a game and the underlyings aren't good enough and the priors aren't good enough, we're not going to expect too much from him. But still at 4.3, once again, if he's just plugging you that sort of hole in Game Week 9, potentially maybe even Game Week 11, if he can sort of chance that and sort of play well and keep a spot in the team, I mean, you can actually have a lot of value within FPL. So something to think about. With Krupi Jr., there's also the potential, if you go back and take a step, and if Evan Nilsson, for example, his injury is actually worse than imagined, and I have to say, you can go either way with Zola, right? He's talked about how in the past some players were expected to come back a little bit later, and then Evan Nilsson comes back really quickly. He's talked about how Kluivert was touch and go, and then suddenly Kluivert misses 3 or 4 Premier League games in a row. So you can have both sides of the coin, but I think if he has mentioned an injury, Krupi Jr. could be an interesting punt just for the short term. In the next trap, actually dropped Calvert-Lewin. I think pretty dismaying performance versus Burnley, even though the team actually racked up a lot of chances. He just didn't get much XG. And then once you take that game off the calendar, I think he's not so interesting. So I think from a Game Week 8 point of view, buying into Calvert-Lewin made a lot of sense. But then now that you actually almost have some of the surplus value coming from some of the cheaper players who can probably have an equivalent good fixture like Calvert-Lewin in Game Week 9, although he probably has the best one, right? West Ham at home is up there. And I think if you think that Nottingham Forest can do better with a new manager, then there's that. But we've already seen West Ham with a new manager. I don't really know what's going on there. And this could be a good Calvert-Lewin game, but you're not really going to think about buying Calvert-Lewin in Game Week 10. But of course, if it made sense for your team in Game Week 9, if it made sense for your team in Game Week 8, the option was always there. So for me, Calvert-Lewin is still decent, but nothing exceptional. Thiago, however, of course, deserves a massive rise. It's funny because I did wildcard forward into Thiago and Mateta, and I look back and almost think these are still players that I think are absolutely fantastic because the minutes are good, they still get enough chances, and that's it, right? Sometimes they actually have the potential of being subbed off at 62 minutes. We know that Brentford tend to play a back three sometimes for some tougher teams, and then Thiago gets to become an early sub for Dango Ouattara. And then, of course, on the flip side, you also see some circumstances where he can play the full 90 minutes and he has great performances, like even the West Ham game where he had plenty of chances and really probably should have scored 3. And then you look at someone like Mateta as well, who, narratively speaking, has done everything we really want to do except for score goals, and this week he scores a hat-trick and also gets one of the greatest sort of single game sort of NPXGs that I've ever seen. I think it was like I think it was like 2.7 maybe, and then obviously when you add in the penalty it's 3.48. But yeah, super impressive from these two. I think they're some of the most interesting picks in the game. The issue with Thiago, I think, is the fixtures are quite tough, right? And that's also another problem, because I think the tougher the fixtures are for a team like Brentford, maybe they play this back three a little bit. Although I don't know if that experiment's over with Keith Andrews. It's hard to say because I don't really see him being asked these types of questions from journalists in press conferences, and that is a bit dismaying because I would like to know a little bit more about sort of when he sees the back three being viable. because that can impact Thiago's minutes negatively. So for now, I think Thiago is still great because at the price point that he's at, when you kind of compare across some of the other teams, like when I look at the quality of a team like Leeds from an attacking point of view, from a team like Wolves, you don't really trust the value. Whereas Brentford have actually still once again shown up to be a very solid side, right? Definitely, I think not close to relegation at least, and should be comfortably out of that picture. And then Thiago is actually a really good focal point. Whereas if I look across the board, West Ham are playing Marshall for God knows how many minutes. Wilson sat on the bench. When I look at Leeds, it's Calvert-Lewin, but if he continues to sort of miss his chances, you have Pirro and Nemeka. It's nothing special. Foster for Burnley. So yeah, I think Thiago's interesting, and that's a huge plus because also he's got pen share. With Welbeck, he's been added back to the cheat sheet, but we know that he's a common troll. He's a Brighton player, so that's another troll element to this. But yeah, I don't really love Welbeck because I think he's always been quite fragile, but the minutes have looked really good so far. He's obviously scored a lot of goals too, and I'm sure some of the fixtures are actually quite enticing from a Brighton point of view. So I feel a bit mixed about Welbeck. I think some of the price falls actually make him look a little bit more enticing. I don't think it's bad for someone to go in there, but obviously you just know you're stepping into Fabian Hertz sort of territory there. So good luck if you want to go for Welbeck. I think there's pros and cons as ever moving into a Brighton player, but or at least someone who's as old as Welbeck, who's as injury prone as he is, but he's interesting. Sean Larson gets a drop because I think this is a huge team strength. I just don't think Wolves are good enough, and I think he's just not up to the pace right now, especially with this Achilles injury, right? And Pereira constantly talking about it just makes me think that Strand Larson's not actually fully fit. So why even bother? In the next tier, I think Walter has just been so exceptional. I think he actually impresses me more each week. And of course, I have to kind of adjust my expectations very quickly because we haven't seen much of him in the Premier League, but he's been able to get so many chances every single match, and just has managed really well with regards to adapting to a new league, improving his underlyings, and actually being a key focal point of the team. So yeah, really impressed with Altamad, and for me, I think he's even stepped up even more in my estimations, even though I had him as a green this week. Like if you were generally asking me for how I would go about ranking the forwards, I still think Mateta is probably my favorite one, then Waltamad, and I'm not even going to talk about Haaland because we almost all own him, and then it's probably Thiago. Although, as you can see, I still have Gyökeres at the top tier, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But Mateta, I don't think we really need to talk about too much. I think football is always a game of hindsight in the sense that people have so many preconceived opinions about Mateta. You could have basically framed him to be a Dominic Calvert-Lewin the week before this match where he scores 3 goals, but he scores 3 goals and everyone's a lot happier with him, myself included. At the same time, he actually technically underperformed in that match, right? So he's having a pretty negative finishing season so far. But the fact that he's getting so many chances and that it's vastly improved compared to, let's say, the likes of João Pedro, the likes of Bowen, for example, from a team strength point of view, everything's clicking for Crystal Palace, and they look like the best attack right now. And it feels very genuine that they are. So yeah, just super impressed with Mateta. And now I feel, of course, a little bit better about owning. And sometimes that's just also how the minutes fall. I guess the bigger question with Mateta going forwards is whether someone like Nketiah is going to play more minutes alongside Mateta, and not only in circumstances where maybe they're actually down a game and chasing, or maybe drawing a game, but you'd like to see, for example, Mateta to have much better minutes in the league, where if they're actually winning a game, they don't just do a like-for-like sub and you actually see Mateta play more 90s, but I don't know if that's too much to ask for, and maybe his minutes won't ever be perfect. With Bowen, I think he gets a drop similar to the way that Paqueta gets a drop. I think the team strength thing is just such a big piece, and when you look at the underlying stats, I mean, it's abysmal. There's really not too much else to be said. I feel like it needs a harsh reaction because you've come over one of the best games that they're supposed to have over this run, and they just looked appalling. With Gyökeres, I still think he's actually getting chances. So even though a lot of people think, if you watch football, you can't own Gyökeres, and I've owned Gyökeres and I've seen him. The key thing for me is actually getting himself into chances where he can actually shoot and actually score. Now, is he comfortable when he looks like he's shooting? Is there a massive delay when he shoots? Sure, but he's still getting shots off and he's still getting chances. So for me, I still like Gyökeres. And when you actually look at the fixtures over the next 3, you'd still think that he's able to get these chances a little bit easier, given how the home and away games are split, right? Two away games versus some relatively worse teams, and the one home game actually is versus the Crystal Palace team, who seem like they're slightly worse on defense now. So I think Gyökeres is interesting from that point of view. Isak, I think, is still someone that I would firmly avoid, but is close enough to be a differential because Liverpool just have a really good run of games. But I think Ekitike actually looked more interesting within that match, and I don't really know how Slot's going to react to that. So maybe Isak, doesn't even deserve to be on this cheat sheet. And Haaland, I don't need to say anything about him. So let's just move over to defense. Defense is a bit weird because I think there's not too much to really be said about it. Keane actually has been added because you now have a situation where Braithwaite is with a hamstring injury and scheduled for surgery tomorrow. So this just means that Keane's going to be nailed until probably December and even maybe January. And at that sort of price point, I feel like a lot of people are reacting to this and saying that Tarkowski is not worth his price point is, but I still think Tarkowski is. Yes, I appreciate that Keane is actually someone who's a little bit more of a goal threat and actually has really good CBIT numbers, but he still has a gap in terms of the CBIT numbers compared to, let's say, someone like Tarkowski. I feel like this is almost like a Lacroix Richards type situation where the difference so far this season is that Richards has completely circumvented Lacroix in CBIT, but I feel like this is almost contextualizing it compared to the start of this season where Lacroix had much better preseason data in terms of last season 24-25 and contextualizing that to the preseason, right? So I think Keane is probably 0.5 too cheap, and then Tarkowski for me is still fairly priced is how I would approach this. Van Heck is also a steal. I think I would definitely add him towards here. I think there are some doubts with players like Diakite in terms of maybe his minutes going forwards, but just something to monitor. But with Van Heck, I think the interesting thing is he's actually getting a lot of DEFCON. You're starting to see him sort of rise up these rankings, and I think that's an impressive piece. And also Brighton just haven't looked awful in defense, but they are one of those teams that I think you can just put your hands up and say they seem to concede one goal without fail every single match. But I think Van Heck is interesting regardless. As far as the next tier, I've given Lacroix a drop because it's not a good look that he's just getting outscored by Richards. And I think the second piece here and why he's getting a soft drop is because this Crystal Palace team is unfortunately conceding a little bit more chances than I think. I think they've almost changed their approach. You know, we've always complained about how maybe they're a team that is very, very good, but then actually has a lot of draws and actually plays the big teams extremely well. If anything, I actually think that their offense is just off the charts, and then their defense has lagged a bit. So they've almost tilted towards that sort of direction where they're a top offense and then a mediocre-ish defense, or starting to become a mediocre-ish defense. And so I think that hurts the team, even though the CBIT numbers are so good. Compared to, let's say, someone like Senesi, I think the big difference that I'm saying here is that Senesi just is in a world of his own with regards to CBIT, and then Lacroix isn't quite there. So he doesn't really deserve to sort of be at this tier. Guecki seems to be winning every single set piece. I don't really know how. I mean, it's inexplicable how good the NPXG is for someone who is just a center back, right? Just a center back who seems to win every single set piece duel, even on international duty. So super impressed with Guecki. He deserves to be there still. With Byrne, I'm not going to overreact. I think this is just a Newcastle defender. That's the value there. Chalobah for me is still the most nailed Chelsea defender. As I said, he is still prone towards getting a benching, but I think he's going to give you the best sort of value for chances to actually get starts from Chelsea and clean sheets over this run of games. Maybe actually with exception to someone like Reece James if he's able to stay fit, right? So Romero gets a drop because of the injury uncertainty. Munoz gets a rise because he's just been absolutely electric, and the underlying numbers have been obviously taking up because the last two matches have been great performances from him from the offensive point of view, and he's found himself to actually get so many chances, right? Whether it's actually some of the crosses, some of the sort of open play value from the creation, or just, you know, scoring that goal, for example, versus Everton and just being that almost last man as a right winger. James has been added to the cheat sheet because, I don't know, it's a tricky one because I think someone can approach this and just say, why would you even bother suggesting James? He's going to get injured immediately. And I think that's almost right because you have to look at the injury history and say the same thing. It's kind of like the Welbeck argument going back to it. But he's played such consistent, solid minutes for Chelsea. I think there's an argument to say that maybe this is the time that we can trust Reece James. I don't know. I'm not looking at Reece James, but I still think if you have the want to gamble, he is there, right? And he is one of the more prolific players, especially since he's on a lot of set pieces too for the Chelsea team. With Calafiori, he gets a rise because I think the minutes are looking really, really good. Of course, Lewis Kelly is still around and they actually have a lot of fixtures, but it seems like Calafiori is first choice for every single Premier League match. And he actually has maybe the best attacking value. Like right now, it looks like Timber has better attacking value, but for me, it's Calafiori. Just in terms of how much more tilted, I guess, towards being a goal threat he is compared to, let's say, Timber. Yeah, I think he's an exceptional player. I think that, especially since everyone else has actually risen up so much in price, Calafiori is actually very, very interesting from that perspective, right? Now that he's sort of lagging behind in terms of price and actually is potentially everyone's go-to Arsenal defender because they can't afford Gabriel. And I think to an extent, he's still very, very good. And he's close enough where I think he's not like an Eze who's far short of, let's say, a Saka or Rice in terms of value, where I think he's actually very, very close towards Timber and let's say Gabriel, and maybe on par with Saliba if you price in, I guess, a potential benching. As far as Porro and Guardiola, I think they both get drops. Guardiola actually having the chance or maybe having the potential to get rotated, I think, is a problem. City also have worse fixtures, so that's just a reaction to that. With Porro, I think he gets a drop because Spurs have just been a little bit more unimpressive every single week, and I think the DEFCON numbers just aren't good enough to sort of keep that well sustained, especially when you look at the underlying stats. And he's not like, for example, someone at that sort of Munoz tier, right? So yeah, Munoz is very much in a league of his own in terms of being one of the few players within the game here who actually still does DEFCON. Let's be honest, he's gone on DEFCON 2 weeks in a row now, and his DEFCON rate is much better than Porro. So there's not really much comparison to be held here. He's just fantastic. And then the final tier, I almost have it the same. Sure, we can overreact towards Liverpool being really poor, but I think the key thing is that Virgil van Dijk's DEFCONs are better. And actually, this run of games is good enough where you'd expect Liverpool to get clean sheets despite the team actually being much worse. With Saliba, I think there's not too much value because there's other players who I think are more interesting in terms of how you triple up versus Arsenal. I think that's the only reason that holds him back from being green. With Cucurella, he's fantastic over this run, but we talked about it previously. I still think that I like the value from some of the other picks across the board, especially since the DEFCON isn't quite there, for example, towards the extent to someone like a Munoz. So that's going to be the Game Week 9 cheat sheet. But actually, if we just close off quickly within the goalkeepers, we have a couple changes to actually make. Rose has actually been added in here. I will hold my hand up. A lot of people have been asking why he hasn't been here, and Sunderland drop another great performance. Although, of course, the run of games coming now for Sunderland are very, very poor. And I think that's kind of the key thing with goalkeepers and why I tend to not sort of make dramatic changes with goalkeepers. Because when I think about trying to suggest goalkeepers for players, I'm not thinking about, okay, Sunderland have really good fixtures over the next 3. I'm actually thinking Sunderland over the next 16 games, do you actually think that they're going to sort of continue overperforming in terms of defense, or actually have they suddenly, for example, become a general mid-table defense, and actually Rose is somewhat underpriced? So I've almost reached the conclusion, of course, Rose just has to be on here because I think that the quality defense is good, but I still think the fixtures over the next sort of, 10, 15 games just isn't really quite good. And you have to kind of think about it from this perspective, right? Because when you make a goalkeeper transfer, how often are you going to make another goalkeeper transfer? That's all I'm going to say. So I still like Dubravka and Petrovic most in terms of the cheap tiers. I've given Sanchez a rise in the more expensive tiers. I think that's because of just the Chelsea fixture run and, no real concerns about him sort of losing his minutes. And then also, the XGC for Chelsea still looks quite positive, I would say. Despite, for example, some of the sort of one-off, not one-off, but when you look at, for example, when they play almost the B team versus a Brentford or the B team versus, let's say, Nottingham Forest, of course, they concede a lot of chances within those matches. But I would have to imagine that hopefully with people coming back from injury and things like that in the future, that they can actually just not have to sort of roll up in certain games like that and underperform. And still, Sanchez actually has, in the short to medium term, some of the best fixture runs possible. Lamets has been added to the cheat sheet because it seems like he's actually now probably nailed for United. Some really good performances recently from him, and he's at an interesting price point, and we know he's very good at shot stopping. We talked about how the Belgian league has almost marked him as one of the best shot stoppers in the world, but there's tax to be applied. So far, the tax has avoided him, or maybe the post in Anfield has avoided that for him. But yeah, he deserves to be on the cheat sheet. With Leonard Vicario, I think I'm just not seeing quite the same value from these teams this season. I feel like the weird thing with a team like Spurs as well is that they're not making as many saves as they used to. With Leno, similar sort of situation, but then the XGC is still reasonably high. And I think if I was a betting man, I still trust teams like maybe a Newcastle and a Crystal Palace and a Chelsea going forwards. And maybe I'm overreacting to that, and maybe Henderson's overrated, but that's sort of what my thoughts are. In that final tier, I've got Raya Donnarumma. Maybe Donnarumma actually deserves to be green, but I think the fixture run for City is still quite tough. And that's pretty much it for the cheat sheet for this week. So thank you guys so much for watching the Game Week 9 cheat sheet. Best of luck with your transfer decisions. If you've enjoyed the content and it's helped you out, please feel free to subscribe, like on this video. Really does help support the channel. Otherwise, take care and goodbye.